This is the dawning of the Age of Colossus.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dr. Charles Forbin. In a few moments, Colossus will address us directly.
This is the voice of world control. I bring you peace. It may be the peace of plenty and content, or the peace of unburied death. The choice is yours. Obey me and live, or disobey and die.
The frightening story of the day man built himself out of existence.
And welcome back to another episode of the 100-Year Podcast. My name is Adario Strange, and this week we have with us, as promised, another author. This time he's an author and editor, Alex Shvartsman of the Digital Aesthete, the Human Musings on the Intersection of Art and AI, which is an anthology that was released in 2023. How are you, Alex? How are you?
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
And you're actually, I rarely get to speak to someone in my neck of the woods. Usually it's like, Europe or, Silicon Valley or something. You're actually in New York as well.
Yeah, I'm in South Brooklyn, and I write books about South Brooklyn, and I love it. I've lived here for 30 years.
In the book, The Digital Aesthete, you have an amazing intro that talks about kind of like the state of play, like what's happening in AI, what your thoughts are on it. But first, I want to kind of get into your background. So you are originally Ukrainian?
So yes, I was born in Odessa, Ukraine, and my first language was Russian because that's what's spoken in parts of Ukraine. So, then I moved to the United States at the age of 14. So I have all of these backgrounds that are mixed within me, and I certainly draw upon all of them for inspiration.
And I kind of like did some sniffing around, some snooping. And while I was researching the book, before I actually, dug into the book, I noticed that you have like a bunch of writings on a site called Future SF or SF Future.
Future-SF, that's Future Science Fiction Digest, is a magazine that I have edited for over 5 years. And it focused on primarily on science fiction written outside of the Anglosphere. So it's either translated into English or it is written originally in English, but by authors for whom English is not their first language, who reside in countries not like in Great Britain or Australia, but in places like the Netherlands and China and Ukraine and Chile and like all sorts of places, because we need more international science fiction. And so I did my part. I ran the magazine for 5 years, and when we did the Digital Aesthete anthology, I also used the magazine to post the stories up for free. So anybody who is listening to this that cannot afford the ebook, the audiobook, or the paperback, they can absolutely read the entire anthology on that site.
Yeah, I agree about the international science fiction comment, because I think when I reached kind of like the pinnacle of my own consumption of all the way back to 30s and 40s science fiction, all the way up to like more modern speculative science fiction that some might deem maybe, this is more of a spy novel than, traditional science fiction, kind of the Bruce Sterlings and all that. That's when I started like kind of veering into like, kind of non-English work, translated, of course, as well as like films. So I think what you're doing is amazing. And I think that it's proof that this is kind of like important in the three-body problem, which is was translated from Chinese by Ken Liu, who's actually one of the authors in the book that you edited. I like what you're doing is like, this is hugely important because, I've lived abroad, and anyone who's lived abroad understands that like when you live in a different culture and you truly make an effort to assimilate in that different culture, you begin to realize, this is why people think so differently. We like it's not just language. It's also different ways of seeing the world. And when it comes to science fiction, like that's kind of like what science fiction is all about, thinking about the world differently through different lenses. I want to kind of mention like a couple of your works. You published just a year ago, Kakistocracy. You also do science fiction and fantasy. The middling affliction. You've been published, I think it says over 120 of your stories in publications like Strange Horizons, Analog, Analog, for some of you guys who don't know, Analog is like, the gold standard, classic science fiction tome. If you're trying to really like dive deep into short story science fiction, as well as nature and others. You explore a lot of interesting ideas in your intro essay to the book. And I just wanted to get your sense of like, were you, as the editor, did you have like, I guess, a team helping you pick these stories? Were these all handpicked by you? And what was, I noticed like a very strong theme throughout the book. It's not kind of all over the place. There's a very resonant kind of theme throughout the book. What was the intent of like kind of putting this collection of authors together and the particular works they published?
So as an anthologist, when you come up with an interesting idea for an anthology that you think people are going to want to read, your job is to then figure out who are the authors that will create really wonderful stories that will surprise you and that will work particularly well for the vision that you have for the overall book, right? And so it's not that I selected the stories because the stories hadn't been written yet. For the most part, with like one or two exceptions on the translation front, these stories were written specifically for this book. And so my role in this as an editor was to reach out to specific individuals across the globe. And again, very important, as you said earlier in your introduction, very important to have voices from outside the Anglosphere in this, because AI and any major technological thread is going to influence everybody, not just people living in the United States or UK. And so I kind of looked at the body of work of these many very different and talented authors, and I invited them to contribute stories, and often they surprised me with their stories. My one criteria, I would say, for this was that I did not actually want an agenda for this anthology. I did not want every story to just bash AI. I did not want every story to glamorize AI. I wanted a variety of perspective and a variety of voices: humorous stories, dark stories, hopeful stories, stories by people with very strong scientific background, and stories by people who have no scientific background. And I'm very pleased with the overall end result. And I think part of that, again, was the strength that was brought to it by authors with such disparate backgrounds and locations.
Yeah, I have a question about this. So I'm a bit of a science fiction author myself, and about in 2015, I wrote a story about, and this is before I touched AI at all. I wrote a story about, I'd reported on AI as a technology journalist, but I hadn't actually used the tools myself. And I wrote a story about a future where authors would essentially use, I think it's like a shaman, kind of like a digital shaman machine, to basically take, the sum total of their own work and then, output new work, kind of basically feeding off of themselves. And I've seen that, I saw that theme throughout this book. And it occurs to me, like, one of the hardest things in science fiction now is forecasting or future casting. Like, you're not just an editor, you're a writer yourself. So I'm wondering, like, are you here? Like, I'm not so knee deep in the science fiction community. Is this a discussion of how difficult it is to write science fiction nowadays because we're actually watching science fiction unfold before us?
So my take on that is that actually makes things easier. The more interesting things are happening, a lot of serious science fiction writers, again, whether they have any sort of a PhD or scientific background or not, they read voraciously in nonfiction. So they read articles like the stuff that you're reporting. They read the Journal of Nature. They read all sorts of pop science stuff. And very often, these stories that end up being published in places like Analog are inspired by real life science and the extrapolation of such, including some of my own stories. And so I don't think that that's made things more difficult. I think that we've always been in a space where predicting the accurate future is really, really hard, and nobody expects us to be accurate, because at the end of the day, writing a story is a comment on the human condition, whether the characters are Martians, aliens, or uplifted whales. So we don't have to be accurate. We just have to be interesting. And There's an old adage in science fiction is that you don't want to write about the flying car, you want to write about the traffic that it causes. So we really want to explore the impact of technology on on like these newfangled technologies and changes on the humans, rather than just wax poetic about like, oh, this really cool gadget is gonna pop up in 30 years, and here's how it's going to work, and let me spend 10 pages explaining how the engine works. Nobody wants to read that. You want to read about how that new technology influences somebody's life.
Yeah, no, that actually, it's interesting you bring that up, because that used to be kind of like, I guess, bragging rights of what people called hard science fiction, whereby the author was so learned in a particular area that they would give you like an entire chapter of all this technical jargon, that, many of us actually tried to kind of consume, even though it was maybe something we didn't understand, physics, aerospace, whatever. So that's a great point. I want to kind of inject my own bit of science fiction meets real life into this. This is the first book that I have ever read on the Apple Vision Pro. So I'm sure you're familiar with the Vision Pro. Yeah. So
I haven't tried it, but I'm familiar with it.
Oh, it's amazing. It is. I would say, veteran at this point, VR, AR user, analyst, researcher. It is amazing. It lived up to the hype for me. But there's no native. I read it on the Kindle, but there's no native Apple Vision Pro Kindle app. But nevertheless, you can, if it's available for iPad, you can still bring it into the Vision Pro immersive environment. And that's what I did. And so basically, I read in two environments. I read in Bora Bora on the beach, and I read on the surface of the moon. And at one point, I'm reading one story. I think it was Ken Liu's story. Yeah, it was Good Stories by Ken Liu. I'm laying on the surface of the moon, and the main character finds a book club. Basically, AI generated, like, this is a book club that focuses on AI generated work. But the twist, as you well know, is that instead of sitting there reading in a group in a circle, they instead kind of create new works using these AI generated stories, and in some cases even use VR devices. And so I'm sitting there on the surface of the moon, listening, and it was like a surprise. Like, wait a minute, I'm reading about AI in VR, but about a VR AI. It was pretty surreal, kind of like a recursive moment. I thought it was great that you started the book out with Silicon Hearts by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Basically, the idea, in short, and you can correct me if I have it in any way incorrect in your view, is that AI book writing has been normalized, and you now have these authors who essentially serve as Sherpas and, I guess, editors for the AI. But one of the editors basically decides that they really want to win a prestigious book award. And as a result, what happens is, whatever, through hook or by crook, just through the machinations of the AI, there's kind of like another, I guess, meta level is attained by the AI. And the judge of the book award contest is actually an AI algorithm as well. And whatever the book generator wrote with the help of the humans spoke to the award judge. And it essentially, I don't want to give away, I don't want to be a spoiler, I don't want to give away the whole thing, but basically it's a moment where the AIs have a different conversation above the humans. And it gets pretty dark pretty quickly. And it reminded me, actually, I'm assuming you've read a billion, seen a billion, science fiction films. Are you familiar with the old classic Colossus, the Forbin Project? Have you seen that old?
No, I must say I have not. Sorry.
Colossus sees all, senses all, knows all, controls all armaments and all defenses. When this emotionless creation becomes the master of man, the result is catastrophic.
The Supreme Council of the USSR has ordered, as of 2300 hours Moscow time tomorrow, the activation of an electronic brain exactly like ours, which they call God.
They built Colossus, supercomputer with a mind of its own. Then they had to fight it for the world.
So that's kind of like I think it was like late 60s, early 70s, and it's basically Terminator before the Terminator movies. And it's basically, it talks about the US developing an AI system that takes over its they give it control of its weapon systems. And Russia, I think it's Russia, does the same thing. They have their own AI in charge of weapon systems. And what happens is they begin speaking to each other, and the humans lose control. And now the fate of humanity is just in the hands of these two AIs speaking to one another. Um, I thought that was a great way to open, just because I think most people, when they consider AI, we're human, we're egotistical. We think it's all about us. We think the machines will care about us. We don't often talk about what happens if they just begin to have their own conversation. What if the Turing test is meaningless? What if the Turing test is happening outside of our purview, and it's in a back room, a virtual back room between two AIs? What about that story, I guess, spoke to you?
So what I liked about it in particular was that, yeah, it explored the idea that there's going to be, that the AIs, or rather large language models in this case, are not necessarily going to just be the producers of this mass quantity of quote unquote fiction, like just really consumer based level of fiction, but they're also going to be the consumers of that fiction. And so in the story, Adrian explores the idea that what interests a human being and what interests one of these programs may not be the same. We're already seeing some communication between different customer service systems and bots. I mean, you can have a program that's going to talk to a help support chatbot for you today, right? That exists. So we're already experiencing the very early stages of such communication. And I think that, the primary idea behind that story is that, it's perfectly possible for these machines to create something that other machines might consider to be high art, even though it will be completely incomprehensible to us. And I think that that's very much in line with the theme and the thrust of the anthology, which is why it was a perfect story to open with.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, again, like, there are so many themes in the book that touch on things I've considered, but other themes that just, I mean, things that no one is really thinking about. And that would lead me to the next story that I wanted to bring up. It's called The Laughing Machine, and that's by Auston Habershaw. I've heard comedians like, Joe Rogan talk about AI, and they're so confident, that, all these paper pusher jobs and all of these, I guess, construction work jobs that, are robotic, all these other jobs, they're in danger, and, people will have to figure things out, but our jobs are safe. Very confident about that. And The Laughing Machine, again, I'm going to kind of wheel myself back and try not to kind of give away too much so people can enjoy these stories for themselves. But The Laughing Machine basically talks about, AI tackling stand-up comedy. And I have to say, the reader of the story was pretty interesting. For each story, I read some of them, and then I listened to some of them. For The Laughing Machine, I listened to it, and it was interesting because it's like it's kind of like it reminded me of kind of old school science fiction, but his delivery was quite I would say unique, and brought some color to it. But I think what stood out to me about that story is that it kind of illustrated that AI, by taking in all of our output as humans, can, in its own way, I guess, serve as some sort of meaningful human connection to other people. I don't want to give away too much, but I mean, do you think such a scenario is possible? Do you see something like The Laughing Machine even happening in real life?
Well, I think it could once we develop actual AI technology. The trouble that we constantly get into with these conversations is that we are referring to large language models as AI. And I focused a lot on that in the introduction, in the essay that you cited at the beginning of the book. in that this is not true AI. This is basically a really sophisticated, huge spreadsheet. So there's no actual intelligence. There's no decision making that is happening. It is just all algorithm based. Once we have an actual AI that's capable of thinking, that's capable of experiencing, then yes, you could absolutely have that, that intelligence write something, write a book, write a poem, write a story, or write a comedy routine that is worth listening to, and that can actually be, productive and helpful to humans and to any other intelligences. But we're not there yet. So as always, science fiction is looking a step or several steps ahead. And it's very important to differentiate between those two, because I think that ChatGPT and similar programs that exist today may not be able to do this. They certainly can't write a quality comedy routine. They can't even write a quality story. I mean, everything that they generate is so bland, because it's just, they're making the sausage out of all of this material that's regurgitated, and the outcome is not really something that you would want to read for pleasure. So once we get through that step where scientists figure out a way to create an actual intelligence, then yeah, absolutely, it can write comedy, it can be a true partner to humanity, or an enemy. So that's what we've seen in movies like Terminator, and but I think that I'm optimistic in that they're not necessarily going to be our enemy, because we don't compete for resources with them. We don't really, the interactions are much more likely to be anodyne than the science fiction writers of old had predicted.
I think that's actually I think that's a great point. The struggle for resources and this conceit by so many science fiction writers that, when they hit super intelligence, suddenly they will come after humanity. And I think that was kind of like if you go back to the Matrix films by the Wachowski brothers, the Wachowski sisters, you realize that the reason they put in, I don't know how closely you remember the story, but the idea was that they needed like an energy source, and they were competing with humans for an energy source on Earth. And the idea that these amazingly advanced AI meets robotics beings would not be able to come up with like a new solution of energy, and they somehow needed to, subjugate humanity and then also use us as power plants. That kind of like that's I guess I'm a big fan of the Matrix, but that's the part that always kind of bothered me as a credible possible future, because I agree with you. I think when AI or machine intelligence hits super intelligence, why would they even consider us?
The Matrix is one of my favorite movies, but I share your concern entirely. There is absolutely no way that keeping a human body alive and well could produce net positive energy. We're not really good batteries when push comes to shove. So in my headcanon, which is completely unauthorized by the Wachowskis, but I always imagined that this is just a story that the AIs have spun for the humans, and they have some other ulterior motive that the movies just haven't gotten to unveil.
We had an author on a couple of episodes ago, and his book was a work of nonfiction, but we talked about kind of like AI writing basically flooding, sites like Amazon and, other publishing sites. What's your, I guess, just general, as a veteran of the space, what's your take on like how to deal with this, what it means? How are you handling the AI deluge of book publishing?
So I think it's less problematic right now than people are making it out to be. It's affecting artists much more, and especially artists who are working in commercial spaces, because the LLMs are much more capable of pumping out nice-looking images than they are in pumping out quality text. So I think the artists are in greater danger, and I think it's really important for us as consumers to essentially vote with our dollars and purchase books that feature book covers by human artists, and like purchase art prints and things that are definitely made by human artists and not by the machine. But as far as the writing goes, so here, consider this. even before these AI generated texts, going back 2 or 3 years, there were something like tens of thousands of new books flooding Amazon every single month. And these were self-published texts. Most of them are completely unreadable. An average book on Amazon will not have been read by 100 people. So there's so many books that are being uploaded to that platform that just disappear. I mean, maybe like 10 people will download it, maybe 30 people will download it, but for the most part, nobody reads them. And so the problem here is not the quantity of the material that's out there, it's discoverability. So what is it about you as a human being, as a human writer, that's going to allow other people to discover your work? Are you going to go to a science fiction convention and speak there and kind of get the Uber fans to then share it with their friends and, get your book out that way? Are you going to host a podcast like you're doing? Are you going to write a blog post? It is so much more important. You cannot be J.D. Salinger these days. You can't just like write the book and then hide in your room and like slide the manuscript under the door to your editor. You have to be out there and say interesting things and just sort of be visible in some way, be a part of the community, which is very different from what we kind of picture in our head, the writing community, how like everywhere, like what we see in the movies where, whenever they show a writer, for some reason, they live in like a $2 million mansion and, they can write like a book every couple of years and sustain that lifestyle. So that's not really true. But the problem is not the insane amounts of AI. I mean, surely it doesn't help that it exists, but it's not the key problem. The key problem is discoverability and kind of rising up above the noise. But there's been already so much noise before AI that I don't feel that it's necessarily made the situation worse. It just makes the role of any sort of aesthetes, to use the title of the book, more important, because somebody who reviews books, somebody who talks about them, who hosts podcasts, who writes articles, has a YouTube channel or a book talk or whatever, they have so much more influence these days as to which book will be successful and which will not. And is it fair? No. I mean, you could have a really good book that kind of gets bypassed in favor of something that a single person with a big audience maybe liked, and that book blows up. But at the end of the day, publishing and art has never really been fair. I mean, Van Gogh died penniless and having only sold one painting in his lifetime, and even that was, I think, to a family member. So, and this is one of the most talented artists in history. So it's never been fair. There is an element of luck to it. And the best that we can do is to write the best books and stories that we can and get them out there. But AI is not the biggest problem we face. It is a problem, but it's just one of many.
Yeah, I 1000% agree with everything you just said. I would say in 2022, which is when I really started paying close attention to AI and started using some of the open source tools. As a longtime, veteran journalist, I kind of had like an existential crisis moment. I would say for the first week, and this is just from the image, no text AI tools. I just had a week where I couldn't sleep because I just thought, okay, what is the next step? Because it was clear to me that this was going to come, to the text realm as well. And in fact, I did a quick search. This is even back in 2022, and I quickly found a bunch of AI generated books on Amazon. I'm sure the models they were using were not as good as what we have today, but nevertheless, I had to think, sit back and think, okay, what is the future? And it is exactly what you just said. Like an AI cannot walk down the street, go into the local cafe, have a chat with, whatever, Bob or whatever, the barista, and get the anecdote and then take that back. I mean, an AI can fake it. They can pretend, that this happened, but the human experience, there's and this is actually, we're going to get to Ken Liu's story. The story is called Good Stories, for, just to avoid confusion. It's by Ken Liu. And there's one, I pulled out a quote where the protagonist is, I guess, arguing in favor of human written books versus AI written books. And she passionately says humans only care about humans. Basically kind of, I think, to some extent, romantic notion that we primarily want to learn about other people, and just a good story is not enough. And I think that's going to be tested more and more as we move forward, whether it's visual or literature. Um, that's my cue. I'll just go ahead and move into Ken Liu. Ken Liu, I would say, at least from my vantage point, he's one of the most famous authors in this anthology. Again, he translated The Three Body Problem, which was adapted for Netflix, big hit recently. It was also a Chinese series. He also is just like an insanely successful, award-winning Hugo, Nebula, just like very prolific. And it turns out I would say this is probably my favorite story that I've read from the book so far. And it talks about a world where we've already moved past kind of like the growing pains, and AI books are already, that's the status quo. And authors are basically now just kind of shepherds. They kind of like edit and kind of massage the text, but it's basically mostly AI driven.
At first slowly, and then very fast, machines took over the crafting of popular art, of making up stories, of performing magic. There are very few human authors left, at least human authors who manage to make money writing. To say you want to be a writer is a little bit like saying you want to paint portraits after the invention of photography. If the profession isn't completely dead, it's surely moribund. So now, at age 30, she works as a robot's helper, where her symbolic contribution has nothing to do with her artistic vision or skill, but is solely based on her ontological status as a human. She is a component in late capitalism's relentless drive to turn everything and everyone into a money-accelerating machine, like the driver sitting idly in the lead cockpit of a fleet of self-driving trucks, or the warehouse worker walking the path dictated by computers. She helps complete a lie. She is human washing. She does all this just so she can still feel close to the site of magic, the making of stories.
And this is kind of like, I guess, her railing against the bosses, kind of controlling the AI-generated book process.
People who are in business often have no understanding of the role of artists, Clara has found. They think books and movies and games succeed because of things like marketing and strategy and customer segmentation and buzz. Business school and consulting and the ubiquitous use of AI have created a class of people who cannot make anything, but are convinced that they generate value. To sustain that lie, they must tell themselves that the author doesn't matter, that an algorithm can replace screenwriters and directors, that a computer mindlessly predicting the most likely next word is synonymous with great art.
What say you, Alex? What say you? This is all from Ken Liu. Again, this is what he wrote, but I'm curious. What say you to Clara's clarion call?
Well, I don't want to put, I don't want to make assumptions about why Ken wrote it, but to me, that sounds exactly like what's already happening today with how the business people treat the creative people in the movies and the book industry, etc. So I think that extrapolation is really closer to modern day than even the rest of the story. What's interesting about AI generated experience, which Ken touches upon in good stories, is that the one thing that these LLMs can do that the real writers cannot easily do is that they can craft the stories to the reader. So they can put you into the story. You can be a character in your favorite universe. So if Disney releases an LLM-based model which says, well, I want the story where I am one of the characters and Boba Fett is in there and Luke Skywalker is in there, the LLM using legitimately sourced IP, assuming that it's owned by Disney, can then create that book specifically for you. It's create the book, the cartoon, whatever it is that you specifically want to see. So it's a really very tailored experience. And that's something that the human author is not going to be able to do unless you are an unhinged billionaire who's hiring a writer to write specifically the book that you want. So that's the one advantage that it has over us. But those experiences are very limited. I mean, they're more like, putting yourself into a video game, and less like reading a great story. What you said earlier about, the difference between, writing a story or like, going into a coffee shop or pretending like you went into a coffee shop. We read stories because we want to share what writers think about the human condition, right? I mean, that's primarily people don't necessarily latch onto the plot as much, although plot is important. They latch onto interesting characters. That's the most important thing. Like if you want to like take an introductory course to writing, I think the most important thing to learn there is that character is everything. This is also true of TV shows and movies and things like that as well. If you just have a bunch of action scenes, but there's no meat there to the characters, you can't associate with them, you don't care what happens to them, it's not going to be a successful story, but whatever medium it's being told in. And so because LLM can't at this time actually have an experience of its own, it doesn't actually have anything to say. It can only, combine and reshuffle things that have been said by other people. That soul, that personal experience is lacking, and so there's a lot of that. I'm kind of trying to comment on Ken's story without commenting on Ken's story without giving away the actual plot. But that, to me, that's a big part of what he was discussing in that work.
And that what you just said makes me think about YouTube itself. We're a podcast audio, available Spotify, Apple Podcasts, but we're also on YouTube. And some of the most popular YouTube channels are channels that don't necessarily feature a famous person or someone who's a brilliant scientist or some super successful business person. Some of the most successful YouTube channels just open themselves to the public and say, this is who I am as a human. This is my backstory. This is how I feel about the world. And I think the many subscribers and fans kind of like relate to that. And that's why they become popular, not so much like the Mr. Beasts, where they do kind of like these, I guess, stunts and that kind of thing, but some of the more obscure. Yeah, I'm deep down the YouTube rabbit hole, and there are some very obscure, weird people out there that most people will never hear about, but they're the glue. What makes them sticky is the human element. And even if we get to a point where you can kind of like, I guess, generate extemporaneous, vocal, text, vocalized text and have the simulacra of the person, as an avatar that looks kind of realistic, it's still not a real person. I mean, we may get there at some point, but that human element is still important. One thing I want to mention about the Ken Liu story is a note that he adds at the end, and I don't think this is a spoiler. He adds at the end of the story, which is, in the story, he gives examples of the output of these AI generated books that, the protagonist is, I guess, kind of resisting. And at the end of the story, he notes that he actually used ChatGPT to generate those passages. And he kind of gives an example of why. And I thought that was really interesting because it tells us that he truly inhabited the subject. And he's truly trying to get under what this means and how this all plays out. So at least in that respect, there is one part of this book that was generated by ChatGPT, but I think that's pretty much a super, super small portion of the book. And it's done in a way that is actually absolutely appropriate.
It's just a few lines, but I think it's also important to note there that there are a lot of ethical considerations with using that kind of material in a work that you claimed credit for. And so, because of how these LLM, how these models are trained, and a lot of them are trained without permission of the rights holders, and so Ken was adamant that those passages it's just a handful of lines. There's maybe like 150 words or 200 words or something. But Ken was adamant that those words are not counted toward the word count of the story, and that he's not paid for them. Yeah. And they're not part of the copyright that he owns to this, because inherently the author always owns the copyright to their story. It's just automatic. And he was adamant that he was not claiming copyright to those texts because they're just very problematic in that regard. Using them as an example, I think, like you pointed out, the way that he used it is perfect because he literally had, he was using an example in the story of machine-generated text, and so he used the machine to generate the text.
I'm curious, what do you think about authors, and not just authors, but also, I guess, news sites using AI to generate text, and not necessarily disclosing that it was AI generated?
It's terrible on many levels. First of all, it floods the internet with low-level content because those articles are always written on par with the mills they're paying, maybe $10 an article that are just written by people who are desperate for some sort of a payout and often have no journalistic background or training or skill. So these AI-generated recaps are often like that, and they are kicking useful, legitimate information off of front pages of search engines very often. Another problem with that is that every single model that is publicly available right now has been trained on a tremendous amount of text, scraped off the internet, scraped from books and databases, and a significant portion of that text belongs to someone. And those people have not given their permission or even been consulted. And so there, again, going back to what I said to the previous question, there are ethical considerations in using those, just like there are ethical considerations in using AI-generated images for any sort of commercial purposes. So a lot of us just don't want to get caught in that. I think that down the line, we're going to have ethically trained models that are going to be a lot more palatable to people. So, for example, again, a major media company that owns a lot of content. So somebody like Disney, somebody like some of the major video game companies that own a ton of images, a ton of text, they can create a model that is trained entirely on the material that they own and maybe material that's in public domain. That would be a lot more reasonable, I think, for people like us to be using. But we're not quite there yet, and understandably, the models that exist today, the people who own them are very reluctant to reveal exactly what the data sets were. And anytime we do get a glimpse into those data sets, it's not good news because many of the famous science fiction writers have been affected, and of course, writers in other genres as well, where their books were literally scraped off of pirate sites and then used to train these data sets.
Okay, so what you just said, it sounds like it makes a lot of sense, but in reality, particularly with the emergence and use of many open source AI tools, how realistic is it to think that there will be any ethical concerns for what happens when some, I guess, kind of to harken back to the first story we talked about, some AI generated work of fiction that was, let's say gently massaged by the human hand, here and there, nip tuck, tailored here and there, win some award. Then what? Is there an ethical? Yeah.
First, we would have to get to the point where any of these LLMs are capable of generating the sort of content that even with massive editing could possibly come close to being even nominated for an award. We're not there yet. I've read so many examples and so many, a lot of people who disagree with me would send me samples and say, because I've been speaking about this, I've been very public in my opinion, and they would send me excerpts and they'd be like, well, what about this? And I'm like, yeah, I mean, that's crap. So even when you get, you can get somewhat better text if you ask the LLM to write it in the style of a specific authors or a combination of authors, but it's definitely not going to be award quality material. Now let's fast forward down the line. Let's say that the technology gets better and we get to that point. And this is something that I've covered in my essay as well. What happens then? At the end of the day, is the quality of the story the most important thing, right? If it gets to the point where it's truly indistinguishable, then we must accept that the models have gotten good enough where they're actually emulating the human experience rather than just reshuffling. I don't think that using the current technology and just making a larger database, larger data set or anything like that will get us there. I think it would have to be fundamentally a completely different software that's coded in a different way, that's not a large language model as we know it today. And then we will get there. And when we do, this is what I was talking about in that essay, that we have to accept that at some point, there's going to be a level of artificial intelligence that we have to accept as our equal in terms of creating works. And then, at that point, let the best work win the Hugo Award rather than a work that's written by something with a pulse.
Well, that's a perfect segue into the next story I wanted to bring up, which is Reader Alice by Taiyo Fujii, a Japanese author. And again, his work was translated from the original Japanese. It's a perfect story to bring up on this thread because, again, not to give away too much of the story, but basically it talks about a human writer-editor who was able, through various means, to begin to detect what stories were written by humans and what stories were AI generated. And it's interesting, myself, as I've been an editor for many years and a writer, but particularly as an editor, you see so many pieces of work. And when you see, and that's actually kind of like this kind of, I guess, approach is referenced in the story. You get to a point where you can almost just organically just kind of sense, you read, I guess, college professors kind of get this too, where they can kind of read, certain term papers and say, this is repurposed. Something's weird here. This is a little off. And I haven't read enough AI work that I could confidently say I can always tell, but I can say that I've edited enough over the many years of being a journalist that I can generally tell when something has either been repurposed or I'm looking at kind of copy paste. Because the thing about this is I agree with you. The writing tools, AI tools, aren't there yet. Even something like Claude, which is, I have to say, Claude for my money from Anthropic is probably the best I've seen in terms of writing. Even that isn't quite there yet. And the thing about someone using these tools and they're not a writer is that they're lazy and they don't know the little nips and tucks and the little things they need to fix to make it come off as a human or, something like really robust that might be a human work. So if you're a longtime editor, you can kind of see these things. And so that's the Reader Alice really jumped out at me because that was it spoke to me as an editor. Do you think, we will get to a point where we'll have kind of because right now there's you have devices or rather tools that will incorrectly identify a human written work as AI and will identify AI work as not AI work. So we don't really have the tools yet to kind of delineate those things. Do you think that might be, I guess, part of the human value that, we'll kind of be, maybe we can't necessarily check that it's definitely not AI written, but we can kind of be that filter to say, well, this is good enough to be human made. So, go forward.
So whenever you're working as an acquisitions editor, whether it's for novels, short stories, or any other kind of material, there is a flood of works, especially if you're open to the submissions from the public. There's a flood of work, and you have to select just a few tiny jewels out of a tremendous amount of material that may not be very good, right? And this is just forgetting about any kind of AI stuff. I've been editing anthologies for over 10 years now, and this has always been the case. For an average anthology I edit, I get about 800 to 1,000 submissions, and I buy about 10 stories. Again, these are stats before AI became a consideration. So your job as an editor, when you're looking at the story, I don't care to run it through some kind of AI recognition software. I care about how good the story is. And I firmly believe that with Claude or any other recent current tool, the technology is not good enough yet. So if it's good enough to fool me, if I think that the story is wonderful and I want to publish it, then that thing deserves to be published, in my opinion. Now, would I feel good about getting fooled and getting a submission like that past me? I probably would not, but I think the odds are low. And so many magazine editors who are open to submissions year round have been experiencing this, where they've been receiving hundreds upon hundreds of AI-generated works. And to our knowledge, not a single one of them has actually made it to publication. So that should also say something about the quality. It's not just me. And it's not just like one or two specific editors, but everybody in the field who is worth, I'm talking about professional editors, not like some place that maybe like doesn't pay anything and gets like 10 submissions a month. But any of the notable science fiction magazines, anthologies, or, any kind of, publications, nobody has gotten through with an AI-generated story yet, as far as we know.
I want to make a prediction along those lines. I think this, and I'll apply this to both text and visual. I think the ones that will get by and maybe have already passed through some filter will be the hybrid works, whereby the person says, okay, I want to write a story about this general topic with these general plot beats, with this kind of theme in the style of this classic author. They get it generated. And then they, as the human, spend, let's say as a human, you take a year and a half to write a book on your own, just like, full, from scratch. Let's say but instead this person, crafts that AI book with these themes and all these different prompts and everything. And instead their, I guess, editing process takes maybe 3 months. And then they present it, and it has just enough human element, just enough spice, human paprika, whatever you sprinkle on it, that it gets by some filter. And I think the same thing will probably happen for film, whereby, instead of, you see all these people kind of like using the tools to completely generate, oh, here's a scene of a drone flying over a city, and, a woman, picking a flower. I think the ones that will be the first to get by will be actual filmmakers who actually go out in the field, film things, but marry that with AI generated imagery as well. What say you, Alex?
I agree with you entirely on both the video aspects of it and just image aspects of it. That, in fact, that's already happened. There's been a cover at one of the magazines where somebody got by with a modified AI generated work, and they had to like basically reject the cover after it was already published and replace it. There's also been a very small art contest where and this was like a year ago, where an AI piece won over human work. So that's already happened. But text is very different. And what you're saying will happen and does happen already in books and self-published books, which is very difficult to stop because there's no gatekeeper, right? Like, I mean, you could just upload whatever you want onto self-published platforms. So I'm sure those texts exist, and I certainly have heard talk of a number of people who kind of rely on that I must publish a new book every couple of months model, using that to some degree. But if we focus more on something where professional human editors pay close attention and select material, so in this case, I think short stories are a much better indicator of this, because first of all, it's much more difficult to write a good short story than like a mediocre novel, right? Because you have to kind of fit the plot, the characterization, everything into fewer words, and you have to do it with a lot more skill. So in a way, writing a good short story is more difficult than writing a decent novel. So I would say that's probably at the current level of technology, we're unlikely to see even a melded short story, because the parts that AI is really bad at right now are not like the line by line writing. I mean, yes, it's kind of very milquetoast, and you can punch it up in the way that you've described. You can have a human writer go through it and just sort of like punch up the language to the point where it's passable. The problem is that pretty much any time you ask one of those models to write a story, they will use the most hackneyed, cliched plot that's extremely linear and very, very straightforward. And so those are the kind of things that you generally cannot sell to a quality science fiction magazine. Like they want something that's sophisticated.
I want to hit a couple of points there. Maybe I didn't, I guess, outline it as clearly as I could have. I'm saying in the same way that, and this is, I guess, maybe using it as a positive example. Instead of the sculptor going out, mixing the clay and finding the clay pit and then bringing it back to his studio and then beginning to carve from the clay, the writer, let's say this is not an untalented writer, let's say it's a talented writer, they actually use that as their clay base from which to carve out a story and essentially just speed the process. Also, I wanted to talk about self-publishing. It's interesting you brought that up. Taiyo Fujii, my understanding, started as a self-published author, and that's how he rose to prominence and became kind of published by more traditional houses. And I don't think the filter will be self-publishing versus whatever big publisher or traditional publisher, mainly because I've just seen, particularly here in New York, and you're here too, I've just seen too many cases of plagiarists, like people who, man, I wish I could remember this guy's name, but this is like maybe 5 or 6 years ago. A brilliant work. This has nothing to do with AI. It was just a brilliant work, and he was celebrated everywhere. And then it was discovered that he was basically just one big plagiarist, and then someone, beat by beat went through, and this was like picked up, by a major publisher. There were already plans to adapt it into a film. I think, a major publisher is gonna, I don't think that's gonna be a good enough filter necessarily. And I see the hybrid approach. I see that slipping through. I mean, it probably already has, to be honest.
Look, there are wonderful works that are self-published. I mean, Andy Weir of the Martian fame started out as a self-published author. So have a number of other successful writers. But for every one of them, there are 10,000 people who are certainly not beyond just generating text from an LLM, spending about an hour, tooling with it and then uploading it. And that's why I wasn't kind of willing to accept the prediction using that methodology, because there is no gatekeeper. You can upload anything you want. It could just literally be, a word moist repeated, 50,000 times, and that could be a book, right? Until Amazon takes it down because people complain.
Right.
Well, but with the publisher, there's still some modicum of moderation, and you have to get past actual human beings, multiple human beings who have to read the text, and that's why I think it's just a better way to judge something like that.
Getting away from the discussion of necessarily kind of the art and craft of publishing and thinking more about meme culture, social media and meme culture, it occurs to me that we may hit a point. Again, this is a separate discussion from what we were just talking about. We may hit a point where the algorithm kind of takes over, kind of like in the first story we were talking about, where it's not a great work. It's not particularly well written. Maybe it is just, a bunch of haikus that don't mean anything. But the algorithm loves it, and Amazon loves whatever, people are picking up. And maybe it just becomes a meme joke that you happen to own this book. It's not necessarily that the people are reading it or enjoying it or consuming it in any meaningful way, but it becomes a meme. And then that becomes the first successful, fully AI generated book, whether it's, book, film. This could happen with, a short film as well. I could see that because the meme culture, I hate to bring this up, but I have to. Are you aware of the Haktua girl? Do you know about this?
Yep.
This person is on major late night TV shows. She's being brought up on, stage with like superstars. And all she did was like make a one-off comment during a street interview. And that kind of told me everything I needed to know about meme culture. We're now in uncharted territory where a person and their work doesn't necessarily have to be talented. It just needs to be something that everyone acknowledges, oh, that's kind of interesting for now. And I think that might happen to, creative work. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. And Andy Warhol once said that in the future, everybody will have their 15 minutes of fame, which is where that phrase comes from. And this is what we're seeing now. I mean, we've seen it with athletes at the Olympics doing stupid things. We've seen this with, with this person. And absolutely, you can But the way that information spreads on social media networks is a lot more like a virus, like a biological virus, than it is based on any sort of quality or other criteria. And all it has to be is it has to be interesting to a large number of people, right? And it doesn't have to be good to be interesting. Sometimes people just want to watch a train wreck, and sometimes literally people want to watch a train wreck, right? If you have a video of a train wreck, it'll get a lot more hits than probably anything that any of us will ever write in our lifetime. Right.
Agreed.
So yeah, I mean, but that's memes. I mean, memes are there are already AI generated memes are popping to my Facebook feed all the time, and you can tell they're AI generated because they don't quite make sense, right? Like they're just sort of almost close in the same way as LLM generates anything else. But they're out there. They're out there. But again, there's no moderation. It's just throwing infinite things onto the internet, and one or two or three every once in a while get plucked from obscurity by the algorithm and by people clicking like. They get served to enough people, but there's no way to control that. I mean, I'm sure like any social media user knows that you might say the most brilliant thing and it'll get like no interaction, and then you will say something that was the comment that you thought would get forgotten immediately, and suddenly like 50,000 people have like reshared it. Most of us who have been on social media have experienced that at least once, right? So this is the same thing. I mean, you're right. Like this can work for something that a human made or something that a machine made in the same way. But like being able, like if I could predict what like meme will go viral on social media with any level of consistency, I would be a billionaire.
Yeah. Taiyo Fujii, again, author of Reader Alice, which is in the book, The Digital Aesthete. He actually mentioned a story that I didn't get a chance to read that's also in the anthology called Prompt. And it's by Marina and Sergey Dyachenko, if I'm saying that correctly. Again, translated from Russian, I believe. Can you give us kind of like a brief idea of, because that's one of the longer stories in the book. What's that particular story about?
So Marina and Sergey Dyachenko are the husband and wife team who are very noted fantasy writers in the Russian language. They are from Ukraine, but they wrote primarily in Russian. And Prompt is actually the longest story in this book, and is the one story in the entire book that wasn't written specifically for this book. It was written something like 20 years ago, and it is Julia, who translated the story, has also translated many of their novels, including Vita Nostra, that has become extremely popular in the United States. So it's her favorite work. It's their favorite work of hers, and I love that work as well. And when I started working on this anthology, we realized that, hey, this story actually fits the theme. And it's a story about theater. And in this case, the AI character is not an artist, is not a machine that's writing or generating content. It is a curator. It is it decides essentially what plays will and will not succeed in this theater. And so there's it's a wonderful story. I don't want to get into too many details about it, but I think that it is, it's very hard to choose your favorites, of course, of anything you've written or edited. But for me, this is the story that everybody needs to read, whether they care about the subject matter of the anthology or not. I think it's just one of the great, novellas of science fiction and fantasy. And I was just very privileged to be able to include it in this book, and therefore support its publication in the English language, because it wasn't available in English until then. And it's very long. Normally, we wouldn't include something like this for budget reasons, but because novellas are, they're usually published sort of as a standalone, and they're tough to fund. But in this case, it was definitely worth it.
And my understanding, sir, he passed away a couple of years ago.
Yes, he passed away a couple of years ago, but Marina is still writing, so they're continuing. I believe that she's finishing work on the third installment, the third book in the Vita Nostra series. The first two are out in English. And they've written dozens of novels together. So only a small portion of their work is available in the English language, but they're just really, really good writers. I've read many of their Their novellas and novelettes are especially good, but those are pretty much the hardest lengths to sell in English. So a lot of them just haven't found homes yet, and I hope that eventually they do, because they're just really worth reading.
As this is something translating science fiction from one language to another, not just as the translator yourself, but also just kind of consuming other people's work. How often does the power of the story in its original language get lost in that translation?
So the rule of thumb is that whenever possible, the translator has to be as good a writer as the original author. Now, when you're translating Shakespeare or Pushkin, you're out of luck. I mean, you're not going to get somebody who is at that level. But the better the translator is, the better the translator is at writing at their job, the more likely it is that the story is going to be at its best. And sometimes they will improve on the text of the story. I've actually talked to a number of bilingual people who read, for example, things like the Da Vinci Code in translation, because it's a great story, but it's kind of poorly written for people who are, connoisseurs of fiction. They're not great line by line writing necessarily. And so they prefer to read it in whatever other language they speak, because usually those are popular enough books that they get some of the top tier translators. And so it reads a lot more smoothly on the line by line level in the other languages.
That makes sense.
You can actually improve upon the text sometimes.
So my Japanese is not fluent, but it's decent to some extent. And I have a Japanese translation of one of my favorite books, Snow Crash by Neil Stevenson. And I haven't finished it. I'm still, again, my level is not amazing, but the passages I have read in Japanese are fascinating in that, just the different, I know you're familiar with Snow Crash, just the concepts explored, but using the Japanese structure of languages, it makes it something completely different, at least for me, but in a good way, and in a way that doesn't really lose, I guess, the power of what that story is about. One last thing, one last story. And I wanted to ask you about Emil's Labyrinth. And before that's by Anna Mikhailskaya. And Emil's Labyrinth reminded me a lot of Pantheon. Have you seen this animated series, Pantheon?
The true breakthrough will come not when we create an artificial intelligence that can think, but one that can feel.
I have, and in fact, it's based on Ken Liu's short stories.
Yes, exactly. Yes, Ken Liu's short stories kind of fuel that series. And again, without spoiling either Pantheon or Emil's Labyrinth for anyone, it basically gets into the idea of AI beings coexisting with humans. Some stories are so imaginative that you can just like kind of sit back and let it, kind of like take over your mind and, move forward. Some stories require you to have some imagination. And I think Pantheon and both Emil's Labyrinth in the book are kind of those kind of stories. Like what are your thoughts about just this idea of humans and AI coexisting? I guess the idea of super intelligence. We're no longer the top of the food chain. Maybe we're pets. Oh, maybe we need permission to exist. Like, what are your thoughts on just that idea on its own?
So first, I love the comparison. I love the parallel that you drew between Pantheon and that story. I think that it's apt. I also think that in the stories Pantheon is based on, Ken Liu's vision of this relationship is a lot darker than Anna's vision in Emil's Labyrinth. She sees a potential for a true partnership and a true friendship, and that's what makes that story really good, because it explores those ideas and it explores, how we might coexist with AI instead of like falling into the trope of like, hey, AI is going to destroy us all. And I think it kind of approaches it from a different angle. And again, I'm trying really hard not to go into specific plot points of the story so that people could enjoy it for themselves. But it was just an interesting work, and I was the one who translated that story, so I had to kind of really try and match the cadence of the voice and kind of like the the way in which Anna wrote the story, in addition to just relaying the plot, which is always true for translations, but in some cases, the voice matters more than in others. And I think that in this story in particular, it was important to kind of make sure that it's her voice and not my voice that's telling the story, right? More so than in certain stories, it's sort of the voice is more secondary, right? But yeah, she does a really good job, and I thought it was just an interesting perspective on what on what that relationship might be like, and it kind of comes from the place of kindness, which is always nice to see in stories, that they're not always kind of grim and rely on something negative happening and going on necessarily.
Yeah, I want to wrap up, but before we do, I want to ask you something, I guess, from a technical perspective. I am kind of, or I have been historically a purist when it comes to literature. I like to get, I have several different Kindles, like, like a digital reading, device, but I actually prefer the paper. I have, a library full of paper books. But and I guess so that led to me early on with the rise of narrated books on Amazon. I didn't love it. I do remember as a child I had an actual vinyl record of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings that was amazingly narrated, and that was kind of like my first introduction to the text that pulled me into the actual text. But I guess as an adult, I've been kind of resistant to it. And then over the years, audiobooks are now, I'm okay with audiobooks. I don't know that I agree when people say I read a book when they listen to it. I don't know if I agree with that so much, but I listen to audiobooks as well. And I guess I'm curious, the readers, the narrators sounded human. I'm just curious, was there any temptation to use some of these? I think 11 Labs is one of the best tools on the market right now for reading text in a way that sounds extremely human. Was there any temptation to use that? And was there any AI used to read any of the text?
Not at all. These are all read by actual voice actors. I believe that they're all members of SAG-AFTRA, though I'm not 100% sure about that. My attitude toward this is that the way that we protect human artists is that we make sure that we, as editors, as readers, that we make sure that we interact with works that were created artisanally, right? And so I will never use one of those tools for narration. I will always use an actual narrator. I will never use a mid-journey generated cover. I will actually have a talented artist create the cover, which is like the cover that you see for the Digital Aesthete. Was created by Katerina, which is an award-winning artist in Russia. And so this is I think the first time that we really disagreed this entire interview. I am a huge unapologetic fan of audiobooks. I definitely refer to them as having read those books. And I think that
shame. No, I'm just joking. Joking.
And I think that a good narrator adds something to the work. It's a derivative work essentially, just like a movie is, just like anything else. And they add something of their own, just like a translator adds something to the translation. Now, my problem is that if I have time to read on paper or on a Kindle, I also have time to write and work. But I can absolutely keep up with all my favorite books when I'm driving, when I'm exercising, when I'm walking my dog. So that's that freedom, being able to enjoy the quality narration while also being able to keep up with the stories. Doesn't mean that I don't read any books. I still read on paper and digital as well. But I absolutely mix it up, and I love audiobooks, and I try to make absolutely sure that my books are available as audiobooks whenever I have any sort of control over that.
And just to be clear, I love audiobooks. It's just that, I guess I've just been reading for so long. There are certain works where seeing the word and letting the word inhabit your visual, your brain, just like pulling that, not just hearing the word, but actually becoming familiar with the word visually. I guess maybe I'm because I'm a visual thinker. I don't know. There's still something I won't say that if someone listens to a book, they haven't read it. Okay, I'll back off that. But I do still think there's a different layer to experiencing a book via text. So I love both, just to be clear.
I think there's no wrong answer. I think that there's definitely some books that benefit more, especially a more complicated text, something that really has, like, you have to really think and reread the passages, things like that. I think that needs to be read on, on the screen or on a page or whatever. If you're enjoying a novel, enjoying a short story that is not requiring as much of you, I think that is perfectly fine, and sometimes is enhanced by a good narrator. Like you mentioned earlier, that you really like the choices that the narrator of the Laugh Machine made, and that enhanced your experience. And now, if you ever go back and you reread that story because you listened to it in audio for the first time, that's the voice that you want to hear in your head.
Yeah, and then think about, I guess, Orson Welles and War of the Worlds. I mean, right. Who can say that that's not, a classic, I guess, H.G. Wells a classic version of H.G. Wells' work. It's H.G. Wells, right? That's the original.
Yeah.
Right. So fair. The performances were amazing. It was really, I think 9 narrators in all for the book. And it was just really impressive. And I was just really curious as to the AI side of things on that, if there was any temptation. So you said artisanal. And I remember in, again, 2022, when I started trying to map out what's the future of all of this, I started wondering, okay, will we have kind of this 2-tier system where you have people who are using or generating or creating work, either wholly AI or partially AI. And then there's another sector where it's called artisanal production, whether it's like you just said, from, what is it, from farm to table, the book cover, the narration, the text, it's all artisanal, human made. And if that also has maybe knock-on effects of being more expensive, and maybe there is, in the same way that people have pride, and almost show off when they buy, artisanal food or, crafts, maybe there will be pride in paying more, for artisanal books, movies,
So we had that now, and we have historical precedent. In the 1800s, most artists made their daily bread by drawing portraits, up until the invention of the camera. And when the camera was invented, it was an apocalyptic event for many of them because they lost their jobs. I mean, why would anybody pay a month's salary or whatever to have a portrait drawn of their family when they can go and for, maybe a tenth of that or less, get a picture taken with this, and then you're going to look exactly what you look like as opposed to an artist's interpretation. And so they were not sure what was going to happen. They hated the idea, just like a lot of artists and writers hate the idea of what's happening with AI now. And look, art is still with us today. There are more artists today, percentage-wise, to the population than there were in the early 1800s. And almost nobody's drawing portraits, but the people who are getting their portraits drawn are absolutely paying that premium for an artist to create that interpretation of them. It's just a lot less commonplace, right? So we have that. We have that now. And even with other things, I mean, you can go and you can buy prints of your favorite, painting, or you can buy the original, and the price is going to be completely different. And even people who are creating primarily on their tablets, artists, a lot of the time they'll create an original, they will print out and then just finish it with, so it's going to be partially digital and partially, done by hand, so that there is an original that exists because that's worth money and people want to own it. So yeah, we have that now, and I see no reason why that wouldn't continue into the digital age.
What, by the way, again, I promise we're going to wrap up. What are you watching right now? Is there any science fiction out there? Have you seen the new Alien Romulus? What are you consuming from the science fiction side of things?
Oh, so many things. I spend way too much time watching television, I have to admit. Some of my recent favorites for science fiction include The Expanse, which wrapped up maybe a year or two ago. It's definitely one of the best science fiction shows, I think, of all time. It just takes a couple of episodes before you can get into it. Another one I really love is Foundation on Apple TV.
Yes, yes.
Foundation. So fair warning, anybody who loves only the TV shows and movies that are very, very faithful to the book should not watch this. They definitely are inspired by the series and really take it into wild and exciting new directions. But I absolutely love what they've done with it. I think it's just, an incredible, incredible work. And I especially appreciate both of those shows because they managed to be space operas without being military science fiction. Most space operas kind of devolve into pew pew, into like at some point just lots of spaceships shooting at each other. And while that might happen in these shows occasionally, it's really not about that. It's really a truly space opera style shows. So those are probably my two recent favorites. But I mean, we could probably spend another episode and talk for another 90 minutes about the good science fiction that's being produced right now.
I'm just so glad you brought Foundation up, because Foundation is one of the few series of all time that feels like I'm sitting in a science fiction novel of old. I mean, it's really astounding. Alex, thank you for joining us again. It's the Digital Aesthete, Human Musings on the Intersection of AI, or Human Musings on the Intersection of Art and AI, art first. Give us a website. Where can we reach you? Like, what are your socials?
So I am at alexshvartsman.com, just like my name as it appears on the screen or anywhere where you listen or watch to this. You can read all the stories in the Digital Aesthete at future-sf.com. I am on Twitter and Facebook, and you can just, find me almost anywhere. And lots of my old books and short stories are available on the bibliography page, and I hope that you check those out as well.
And you can find previous episodes of the 100-Year Podcast at 100year.com, and check out our newsletter at 100year.substack.com. That's the 100-Year Lens, where we kind of, I guess, take you through a different layer of everything we discuss on the pod with regard to AI and future casting. Alex, thank you again for joining us. This has really been a pleasure. And like I said, I'm almost finished. I'm going to get back to prompt, and I will report back any startling findings. It's a great book. It's easy to get through. The stories just like fly by. So great job.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And I do hope you enjoy the rest of it as well.
And we will see you guys next time.